about mulatto and mixed race children. She has that information in her own family history, and so she just wanted to know more, hear more about that.
Oh, that's a great question. I believe we were kind of talking about that a little bit earlier. Joe?
Yeah, if you look at the inventory of enslaved people, all plantations kept good records. Now, how revealing the keepers of those records are, that's questionable. There are those out there that are forthcoming with that information. There's some that are not. But if you look at the records of that exist on these plantations, and if you look at the names of the enslaved people, usually just a first name is what they got. If you look at a census document, sometimes in that when they talk about color, you see the word M. Of course, in that period, it stood for mulatto. Now, in a lot of cases, you cannot determine if those mulattoes that are in the inventory of that plantation are actually descendants of any of the white men from that particular plantation. You have to do a lot more research to determine that, DNA and all that. But the fact is, it was there. That happened. There was also a percentage of free blacks of that period who were mulattoes. Now, the important thing is, most of those mulattoes were born of non-consensual relationships, but that DNA is there. I mean, it's proven. There's also been a recent study that proves that enslaved men, enslaved Africans, contributed less to our current day DNA than enslaved women did, which means that a lot of white men were raping enslaved women, and that DNA is still among us. So yeah, it puts those people who carry that DNA in a precarious or interesting situation, because you're kind of dealing with both sides of the issue. Now, unfortunately, that accumulated wealth didn't come with all that, because there are very few of those fathers of those mulatto children that passed on to them the opportunity to accumulate wealth. They didn't give the land to those folks. So we're still dealing with the residuals of that today. And what I would like to do in our next conference with the Slave Dwelling Project, I want to have a track on that very subject.
Yeah, actually, I was looking over the inventory of the enslaved community here at Montpelier, and there was one woman who was described as yellow, and well, while we don't know if she was a mixed ancestry, or at least if her father was white and her mother was black, we definitely know that she was clearly lighter than other individuals on the property. So she may her mother may have, or her father may have been of mixed race, and she was of a lighter complexion. And so I think you can even tell on how slaveholders, like you said, are keeping meticulous records on how they describe people. Which also goes to, I think, the point you were making. I think the question, someone asked a question earlier about how did, or were people nice, were enslavers kind to their enslaved individuals, whether they gave them their freedom or manumitted them or not. One of the vice presidents of the United States, Richard Johnson, I don't believe he ever married a white woman, and if he did, she passed away. But he had a relationship with one of his enslaved women, and she passed away after they had 2 children, and he took up a relationship with another enslaved woman, and they had this relationship for a while, and she tried to leave him for an enslaved man, and he sold her. So whether or not she felt any kind of love for him initially, this idea of consent that we have today when it comes to relationships with people, there's no power dynamic today, or there shouldn't be. but historically there was definitely a power dynamic. So it's harder for us to say yes, this was consensual, or no, it's not, because if a woman said no, I'm not interested in you, there could be serious ramifications, getting us having her sold, having her children sold, punishing her parents, punishing any loved one in her community. So this idea of consent is something that we really have to discuss and think about when we talk about relationships with enslaved individuals and within our own families. For me personally, I am the descendant of both the enslaved community and enslavers. And so these are some things that families, both black and white, people that are of the Latinx community, people from all around the world, that we have to discuss with these difficult topics within our own family, and start to really unpack. Because from my point of view, and I'd like to hear your points as well, Joe, we can only heal both ourselves and our countries and our families if we really unpack sometimes those harder and more difficult truths that may be just lying under the surface.
Yeah, we gotta have these conversations, and that's what the the slave dwelling project has transitioned into. Again, having these conversations around these campfires with people who don't look like us. We got to have these conversations with those folks. When we talk about Black Lives Matter, we got to be talking to other folks. We got to be talking to people other than black folks, and they got to help us carry this message too, because they're part of the problem. It's the structural racism, the systemic racism that that we have to deal with, and we as African Americans, sure, we are the recipient. We're on the receiving end a lot of this racism, but just talking amongst ourselves, yeah, we can do that. But we gotta bring everybody into the fold, and I'm hoping that folks who are tuning into this are understanding the fact that where we are is important. This property here is important to this conversation, because these plantations were ground zero for a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with right now. All these sites that I go to, presidential sites. I've gone to 5 presidential sites and slept there. 12 of our former presidents were slave owners. 25 signers of our Constitution were slave owners. 41 signers of our Declaration of Independence were slave owners. And we've got to tell their stories. We got to tell the good things about them. Yeah, you were founding fathers, but you had flaws. So we got to bring all this stuff into the conversation. Not just telling that good stuff that just makes us feel good, because we've been doing it that way for far too long. We're dealing with the residuals, of all that today.
Yeah, I've often heard people say, and I'm pretty sure you have too, that why do we have to talk about this dark side of history? I never owned enslaved people. I never enslaved a new one. You were never enslaved. So why can't we just get over it?
Yeah, see that. So that's what I hear it a lot. Get over it. Move on. Yeah, but some of those same people will wave a Confederate flag handsomely. Some of those same people are benefiting from accumulated wealth. That their ability to accumulate wealth sometimes is tied in the fact that they deprived us, they disenfranchised us. And it, you got to understand that it is quite a bit. That's a lot to get over. That's historical trauma, yeah. is what it is. And we need to, there's got to be some truth and reconciliation, and you can't have that without having these hard conversations.
That is very true, and so you're really linking the past to the present there. And so I would definitely love to invite all of you tuning in this evening to ask us questions, ask Joe questions, ask me questions, and also share your experiences. If you've experienced something in your own lives, that if you have those family stories that from here in Prince George's County, from anywhere in Maryland or anywhere in the country that you think might help contribute to this discussion, please please type it in our question, our chat box, and we will definitely get there. And Stephanie, you also have a question for us.
Yeah, we have a question. One of the legacies of enslavement is anti-black violence. That's lynchings and police killings of unarmed human beings. How do you explain to the public that this violence is connected to each other?
So how do you explain that the history and the legacies of violence towards people of African descent, slavery, lynchings, and police violence are connected?
Yeah. Well, we got to think about, we got to think about the fact that, the Civil War ended slavery. It didn't end prejudice. You can, there was a period in our history, and it's documented. You could see photographs. You could see photographs of a person hanging from a tree, and you see an audience. It's like our demise, our punishment has always been a spectator sport. You get these stories about mandingos and these enslavers pitting their strongest enslaved person against the other enslavers' strongest enslaved person. Sometimes these men fought to the death. You get these bloodhounds who chased our enslaved ancestors. These dogs just having their way with these folks trying to escape. You get these police forces that are patrollers or paddy rollers, as is pronounced by some, who have to ensure that any enslaved person off a plantation is indeed there. They have a pass. They have permission to be off that plantation. And then you gotta think about those things that replace slavery: convict labor, redlining, poll taxes, Jim Crow laws, all those things that continue to disenfranchise us. That's how you connect those dots. That's how you find out that all these things that we're dealing with today didn't happen in our lifetime. This prejudice that we're dealing with. My parents dealt with it. Their parents dealt with it. I'm sure at some point in the future of my daughter's life, she's 23 right now, she's going to have to deal with it at some point in the future. They said if you don't learn your past, you're doomed to repeat it. Well, we know our past, but we keep repeating it. The thing is that the racism doesn't stop; it evolves. It's just that we think we're where we need to be, and we think our youth are where they need to be. But then you get this young man who goes into a church and snuffs out 9 lives. You get these folks marching on a college campus with tiki torches, talking about Jews will not replace us. You get this young man traveling across state line with a weapon, going to a demonstration and takes out 2 people and injures another. We think we're there. We think we're where we're supposed to be, and then we get our youth, doing such acts like this.
Yeah, it actually kind of makes me think back to both, mainly the 19th century, where you had minstrel shows where white actors would dress in blackface and come down to places, usually from places like New York and Boston, and come to places like Maryland and Georgia and South Carolina and all throughout the American South, and they would watch and learn, or quote unquote learn, kind of African American and African mannerisms, and listen to songs and take those back, and then kind of make a mockery of them through these minstrel shows. And this kind of dehumanization of Black Americans kind of helps you dehumanize people. So then when violence takes form, well, it's justified because they're less than, so you have these this characters of either being kind of buffoons and childlike characters, or extremely hyper-aggressive, hyper-sexualized, that are out to get people, out to get your children, out to get your wives, and you see that when you look at even eras like the American Revolution, and how some revolutionaries are writing about African Americans in the newspapers of the time, because the British were promising freedom. You see it during the lead up to the American Civil War, about when Southern newspapers, or pro Southern newspapers, are writing about how abolitionists are going to incite violence amongst the enslaved community, are going to rise up and come and get you on your farm or plantation, or what have you. And you see it across the United States, when after slavery ends, during Jim Crow, with the incitement of violence, and almost a little over 100 years ago today, where you had these pogroms during Red Summer, and even with the 1920s, unfortunately, we're leading up to those dates now of Black Wall Street and things of that nature, where these pogroms in the 1920s that devastated Black communities. But we do have another question coming in, Dennis.
We have someone asking if you all could weigh in on the current debates and protests around Confederate monuments.
If we could weigh in about the debates and conversations around Confederate monuments. I'll let you go first, Joe.
Yeah. So about 2 years ago, when monuments weren't coming down at the pace that they're coming down right now, I had this term, I called it slippery slope. And where I was then was, if these monuments stay where they were, then they need to be contextualized. In other words, if they could justifiably keep a monument up, then whoever's on that monument, I want to know more than the reason why they were put up there. I want to know how many people that he enslaved. What did he do to assist African Americans in pursuing their happiness? Or if you should check their DNA, will you find somebody who looked like me? So if they could contextualize a person in that manner and tell the whole story, well, then keep it up. But the thing is, you got to also examine the intent of the people or the organization who put it up there, usually the Daughters of Confederacy. And their intent was not pure. Their intent was about a revisionist history, the lost cause. But now, of course, I'm in a place where, you know, if you could justifiably leave it up there, then so be it. Leave it up there. But you got to tell the whole story. Now you got situations like where we're kind of piling on, if you will. Right here, we're in Maryland. In Annapolis, Maryland. Speaking of Supreme Court justices, we had Mr. Taney, who was a Supreme Court justice during
the Dred Scott case.
Dred Scott, yeah. And because he was in on that decision, they took his statue down. I personally didn't think it should have come down. I'm sure he did more things than that decision. And it might have been equally as bad, but I'm sure he did more. He did more things than just that decision. So now we're in a situation where there's no more Lady Antebellum. It's Lady A. There's no more Dixie Chicks. It's the Chicks. We don't have Aunt Jemima anymore. We don't have Uncle Ben's. I'm not saying that we should. We've got people wanting to take the word plantation off of plantation. I mean legitimate plantations, like where I work, Magnolia Plantation. They want to get rid of get rid of that word. When I look at a Confederate monument, I see a slave owner. But also when I look up at Mount Rushmore, I see 2 slave owners. So, and then I already mentioned that 12 of our former presidents were slave owners, 25 members of the signers of our Constitution were slave owners, 41 signers of our Declaration of Independence were slave owners. My point is, we have to be careful in taking down these monuments, and the way we're piling on. We just have to we got to slow down and think about this. We got to let the historians in this thing, and we got to do it right.
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad you brought up Chief Justice Taney, because actually within one of our sites is actually the site of is the home of a former Supreme Court Justice, Gabriel Duvall, who lived in Prince George's County. He owned quite a few, more than a few, hundreds of African Americans. And once we reopen, I definitely invite you all not only to visit here at Marietta House, but come and visit the site and learn more about the site of Gabriel Duvall at the Marietta House Museum, which is here in Prince George's County. So we're not only discussing again those legacies here tonight, but once we reopen, of course, we're closed to the public. But once we reopen, you'll learn more about not just those individuals, but we're really trying to highlight at all of our sites and bring to life these stories that have been left out of the historical narrative. But yeah, I definitely agree that we definitely need to have more context around Confederate monuments. I know that I've always been a fan of having museum professionals and historic site professionals be able to interpret those monuments professionally, because anyone can raise money to put up a statue or a monument. And I know as a public historian, as I'm going around, if I'm walking or jogging, I sometimes stop and I was like, oh, this is an interesting monument. I stop. But the general public, how often, and that's a question for all of you tuning in tonight, how many of you, if you're out biking or hiking or jogging, when you see a monument, when you see a historical marker, stop and actually read it? Very few people, and if you do, sometimes there's only so much space you can actually put on a plaque.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well. Good point. What they did in Memphis, Nathan Bedford Forrest, they had a plaque.
because he was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan.
Right. Yes. But during the Civil War, I mean, he was a good general. I mean, he was a cavalryman, whatever rank he attained, he was good at it. But of course, after the Civil War, he became one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. Well, before the Civil War, he was a slave trader. Well, in Memphis, they had a sign interpreting this across the street was, and they talked about Nathan Bedford Forrest. They talked about everything they said everything except they didn't say anything about his slave owning. Nothing. Zero. Well, they took another bite at the apple, another plaque. They included that. I'm fine with that. Now they're telling, Nathan Bedford Forrest, blah blah. He did this. He did this. He was also a slave owner. He was buying and selling. He was into that. So yeah, that works for me. You're telling the whole story.
Yeah, so I think it's important to make sure you're adding those nuances and telling those complicated stories. I don't think anyone is advocating for closing down historic sites, but it's really historic sites like this in Prince George's County, in South Carolina, and all across the country, to really come and visit or visit us online on our social media pages, to really engage with those histories, ask those pointed questions, and then also challenge us to and keep challenging us to make sure we're telling a more inclusive story, whether it's about enslavement or women's rights or Indian removal. Because tomorrow night you'll be talking about the Native American heritage here at Montpelier. We have another question, Stephanie.
So speaking of historic sites, what do you think about having weddings at Plantations?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Your thoughts on weddings at Plantations?
Well, I work at a plantation, Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, and they have weddings there. In fact, you could have about 3 weddings going on at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens
at the same time.
At the same time, and
wow.
and still going with your your daily function. The thing about weddings at sites like this is it's a part of the bottom line, and these sites must, do what's necessary to meet payroll, or continue to do, to carry out their mission. Hopefully, it's a mission that's all inclusive, and they're telling the stories that they should be telling at these, at these particular sites. I'm hoping that's the case. But I think if sites are as adamant about doing weddings, I think they should be as adamant about doing family reunions. And I mean family reunions of people who were enslaved, of the descendants of people who were enslaved at these plantations. Now, of course, another part of that is communicating with these descendants and having a dialogue and wanting them to be a part of this property. Now, you'll find a lot of us who don't want any part of that because, again, historical trauma, all that's all tied into these places. Now, the state of North Carolina has this policy that if descendants of enslaved people wants to have a family reunion or any kind of event at their particular park, they get it for free. All the fees are waived. I think that these things should be considered at these sites. So if these sites insist on continuing to have these weddings, I think they should be equally pushing, the ability to have family reunions at these sites also, at no expense to the families that want to have those family reunions.
Thank you, Joe. I think we have another question actually coming in.
Yes, we have a question from Patricia asking, were there black slaveholders?
Were there black slaveholders?
Yeah, well, we got to go a little further back than that, and acknowledge the fact that there were Africans selling Africans to the buyers, to the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and English. But bring it forward to these United States, in the fact that yes, there were black enslavers, and there were black enslavers who were entrepreneurs. That was the business model. Now, you can probably count them on one hand, but that was the business model. We also have to take into account that there were some blacks who bought loved ones, and there were these rules on the books that said if you free them, they have to be free somewhere else. So you would keep them in that status. Of course, they're your loved ones, so you're treating them as such, as a loved one. But the short answer to the question is yes, they were black slave owners.
Yeah, when I used to work at Colonial Williamsburg, and there was a couple of cases of African Americans owning other African Americans, and almost every state that I can find in my research, it was against the law for a black person to employ a white person, not as an enslaved person, but just an employee. So if you were a black entrepreneur, a black business person, you couldn't pay a white person to work for you, and there would probably be very few white people who would be willing to work for you. And also, if other free people of color that it may have not been advantageous for them to work for you, or if they were free, they may have had their own business. So if you're trying to make money, what other option do you have other than to contribute to that slaveholding economy and enslave someone? And like you said, many times enslavers were enslaved their family members. Now that does not mean that people were always nice and kind, and a black enslaver was any better than a white enslaver, but it does add some kind of nuance to this. Yes, another question.
So we had a question from Chris. As a university instructor, I talk about tough subjects like lynching and rape with my college students, but how do I start that conversation with elementary school students?
Oh, how do you start a conversation about some of the traumatic events like rape and lynching with elementary school students?
Well, I find that sometimes they start the conversations for you, which is a good thing. But I try to. Usually, my audiences are vast as in the age range. It's usually sometimes a parent bringing, and they got kids with them, and I find sometimes the kids, they ask the more engaging questions than some of the adults. So these we gotta take into account that these kids can handle more than we think they can, and we gotta treat them as such. Of course, now you got to bring it down to their level sometime. I use the word non-consensual. So that's one thing that I've got in my tool chest that goes over, and they still get it. They still get the meaning. Then they may have to walk away from that presentation and ask somebody else to explain that to them. But again, I use that term, non-consensual, and you got to bring these, you got to use these words that mean the same thing, but it has less of a punch. It's down to their level. Otherwise we're just feeding them some lies, and I don't want that. I don't want that either. It kind of goes back to that question that was asked about the it's not a mandate. It's more like a threat coming out of Washington, and not wanting us to have this conversation that we're having right now. We're doing something illegal according to to what came out of Washington, but we got to continue to have the conversations. We got to continue to educate the children. We got to continue to tell them the real story. The unvarnished, the unsugar-coated version of the history that they need to have. And in my opinion, from what I witnessed, that makes these children a lot better person. Again, from where I sit, my bird's eye view of looking at all this.
I would definitely agree. I've had discussions with kids as young as kindergarten and first grade about the Civil War. And were we talking about battles and stuff? No, but the kids were old enough to, at least they knew it. They knew that I was a soldier from a long time ago. That was what they could grasp. They'd seen a penny before, so we could talk, or a $5 bill, so we could talk about Abraham Lincoln. They knew what fair versus unfair is, so kids can understand what is, if someone gets something and if someone has to work and the other person doesn't, and the other person who's not working gets those goods, they understand, hey, that's not fair. So you can break things down for those kids in a way where they can understand. Now, when it comes to some of those more traumatic events, kids may ask about that, and I think it's up to you as the parent, if you're dealing with children at that age, to really engage there. But yeah, sugarcoating history, I find doesn't work, and it becomes harmful actually, because hopefully there's no kids out there that are listening. Actually, we'll use the Easter Bunny instead of Santa Claus. But imagine finding out when you're 50 that the Easter Bunny is not real. And that's, I think, how a lot of people are feeling today when it comes to enslavement, finding out that George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or the Snowdens or whoever that enslaver was, Robert E. Lee, had some problematic practices, i.e. enslaving and owning other people. And so it's not about necessarily vilifying that person, but it's about telling that a more complete story, and so we can learn more, not just about people who owned places like this, but about the communities who built these communities and left a legacy for all of us.
Yeah, and another thing we got to be careful about is this. I often see where these teachers attempt to give the kids an assignment. Good example. This one teacher had a bowl of cotton still in the bowl, and the cotton's just in there. So she passes the bowl of cotton around for everybody to touch and feel and get the texture of cotton. Well, the word got out that this is what happened in class, and an African American parent got upset. And here's what she said: "Well, you had my kid picking cotton. I think that's too extreme. I fault the parent. I'm on the teacher's side. All she did was pass cotton around for. So we ourselves as adults, we need to check ourselves sometimes too, because when we get petty like that, you're in a situation where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And if we go off on something like that, where these people are trying, then we're part of the problem, not part of the solution. Now, I'm not saying every teacher does it right. Some of these teachers, they do some crazy stuff, because I heard some crazy stuff going on, and that's we got to deal with that also.
What was the biggest lie that you think you were taught growing up about history in school?
Well, there were a lot, and I say that because, thinking back to the education that I received, the history that I received, it really gave me nothing to be proud of as an African American. I had to purge my mind of all that, and Hollywood didn't help either. You got Tarzan, you got the westerns,
John Wayne movies.
You got John Wayne. And now you think all the natives, all the indigenous people are bad. That they put that stuff in your head, and they put that stuff in your head about the happy slave or
Gone with the Wind.
Yeah, Gone with the Wind. They put all that stuff in your head. The benevolent slave owner. So it's a combination of things that that came at me. I'm thankful for the moment that I had when I went to Amsterdam, and I went in a place where Anne Frank hid from the Germans. And I thought back to that time in class that I should have been listening more when that lesson.
I think we all have that moment.
Yeah, but because I was in the place, it made it real to me, and that's why I attribute that for this journey that I'm on right now, in finding places like this, because although these places, these slave dwellings, represent something, a bad part of history, but you got to also think about the agency of our enslaved people, the things that we did anyway. For those rice planters to be as rich as they were, it took the engineering skills of those enslaved people that they wanted from that part of Africa where rice grew to insert into that place and steal their labor. But still, these people had skills, they had knowledge, they had know-how, they had agency. We need to celebrate that too. We need to talk about that. Yeah, slavery was a bad thing, but within all that, in all this acquiescing, in all this ability for us to be who we are and be able to do what we do, we need to give the ancestors their credit. And though in that history that was disseminated to me didn't do that, I had to get that on my own.
Yeah, I'm thinking so we're sitting right now literally on the ground where the kitchen complex was for Montpelier, and it takes me back to some of the food that may have been cooked here in this kitchen complex. We don't know who the cook was. We don't know what her name was or his name was, but those recipes that enslaved individual would have been making most likely would have been passed down from generation to generation. Some of those things would have been, those memories and foodstuffs would have been brought over from Africa. And really, it's on estates and plantations and farms where enslaved people lived that real American cuisine, food, is born. I think both our mutual friend Michael Twitty is a great storyteller and culinary historian that I know has helped bring that to life for me. But learning that enslaved people had agency. When it comes to American foodways, American music, almost anything that we can think of with American culture can really trace its roots back to enslaved communities and that agency and that resistance that Black communities are fighting back with. So you had people that were liberating themselves, like George, who liberated himself from here at Montpelier. You had people like the butlers who sued for their freedom here in Prince George's County, but from Duvall, Justice Duvall's plantation. But then you also had the millions of of enslaved individuals who preserve their culture and heritage through music, art, dance, through foodways. And I think visiting here to historic sites like Montpelier and almost any site throughout the Prince George's County Parks Department, as well as I think if you're not here in Maryland, but going to most of your historic sites wherever you are locally, I think really asking those questions and challenging those interpreters and the site management to tell these stories and to help bring the lives to life, and really hearing the voices of those enslaved people that are echoing throughout history.
Yeah, and we've got to we've got to hold these sites accountable. I've encountered a lot of sites that now are, if they're not doing the right thing, at least they have the intent to want to do the right thing. They're bringing in the archaeologists, they're bringing in the genealogists, they're bringing in the archivists. They're looking at their archives in a different way. And I've heard a lot of sites say, well, we don't have enough material, that's why we don't talk about them. They got more than they think. They just got to look at it differently. You can look at a census document. They may not have a number on it, a name on it, but these people are enumerated. That's something. These enslavers pay taxes on people. Search those tax documents. Enslavers died. They usually left wills. Look at those wills. These people wrote letters. Sometimes they'll slip a sentence in there about an enslaved person. Well, so and so sassed me today. We thinking about selling. The whatever family or an individual. Ends didn't meet. We gave this slave a certain day off, or our cook, cook this. Look through those letters. Look at it differently. Some folks, they get these batches of letters, right? And they get so excited. And then they get to this section where they see that their ancestors owned somebody. And then they get turned off by that. Don't get turned off. Embrace that. Share that, because there's some descendant of that enslaved person that might be looking for that information that you possess. So we need to share that.
This is very true. And for those people who are interested more about learning about Montpelier, and because I know we're kind of talking kind of high level about enslavement and its legacies, but if you want to figure out more about Montpelier before we open back up to the site, and even right after we finish this evening, please go to the comment section, and you will see that you can take a virtual tour of our site. That we put the link in the comment section of the chat box, and you can learn a little bit more about the history of the Montpelier Historic Site. And when you're talking, so you were talking earlier about about getting uncomfortable with finding out that your ancestor owned someone or sold someone, and for me personally, that happened to me. I had an ancestor. His name was John Hardiman, and he was white. He was from Virginia. His father, his name was George Washington Hardiman. I apologize. His dad was John Hardiman, who served in the Continental Army. His son moved out to George Washington Hardiman moves out to Tennessee on a land grant. On all the census documents, he's the only white man living on this property, and he has enslaved women and children that are living there with him. Every year, the amount of children increases. And I finally found, thanks to another distant cousin, found out that found his will, where he freed my ancestors, but then he sold one man on the property. It took me a while to help unpack that, even as an African American, how to unpack that and come to terms with that legacy. We have another question coming in, which is exciting.
Okay, so this is a good one. How do we raise a generation of anti-racists?
Oh, how do we raise a generation of anti-racists?
Wow.
Thank you for that question, whoever asked that.
Well, Black Lives Matter. We've I think, my daughter, I got a 23-year-old daughter in vet school. She gives me hope. because she could tell me she's bringing a friend home. I don't know what color that friend is until I see them in my home. I do know that when I was coming up, I'm from a very small town called Kingstree, South Carolina. No, that just didn't happen where I was from. So that certainly gives me hope. A lot of these protests that are going on as a result of the death of George Floyd and others who have been, I think, taken away unjustly. In these protests, I see the demographics. I see a lot of diversity in these groups, in these audiences of protesters. Now, we got to distinguish between protesters and looters and rioters. That's different. So I that also shows me hope, and of course that certainly should be encouraged also. If we look at where we are right now, we look at the presidential race, and the fact that there's an opportunity to elect an African American vice president. That's hope. That's telling young African Americans in general, and especially more specifically African American females, that could be you. At some point. And another thing is this. It's the browning of America. The fact that we're going in the direction, probably not my lifetime, maybe yours, some younger folks. The whites aren't going to be the majority anymore. Of course, now that majority is going to be a mixture of other combination of ethnicities, but whites are not going to be that majority anymore, and we got to accept that. There's a lot of pushback to that now. And it comes in the form of, voter suppression and closing down borders and banning Muslims, and that kind of attitude is on its way out. These younger folks, if you don't listen to younger folks, they got ways of making you listen. They got this thing called TikTok. They'll go on your website and they'll make you think that you're going to have this vast audience, and turns out it's not that. These young folks are technologically advanced, and if you're not listening to them, they'll make you listen. So there's hope.
Well, we have about 15 minutes left, so please, if you have any questions for us, please chime in now, because we'd love to hear them. If you have any questions, comments, but really to the question that viewer asked, to how to create a kind of a anti-racist society, I would say having conversations like this across the board. Not just listening to echo chambers. And I know currently we live in a pretty polarized political society, but being open to listen and to actually hear what someone else is saying, that does not mean you need to agree with them. Also, teaching accurate history. And I know history can be also politicized, but looking at the primary sources, looking at coming to historic sites or going online and looking up and pulling up documents of slave inventories, talking to family members, having discussions in school, to have these debates and discussions around what the legacies of enslavement are, what are the legacies of Indian removal, what are the legacies of the Chinese Exclusion Act, what are the legacies of the Mexican-American War, where America pretty much stole vast amounts of land that used to be Mexico, and now we call the Southwest. So these complexities that make the United States the United States, we can't create a more perfect union without having these complicated and hard conversations and not shying away from them. But we can't have an anti-racist society unless we look at equality and equity across the board. So we can't just focus on race. We have to also look at gender disparities. We have to look at how we treat our immigrant communities, our religious minorities here in the United States, also the LGBTQIA community, and how and we can't say Black Lives Matter without saying that all Black lives matter. So that includes Black women, our Black trans brothers and sisters. So we have to really we have to think about anti-racism, but then also across the board. But Dennis, we have another question.
So we have a question for Joe. If you could talk a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities presented by this COVID-19 pandemic for your work.
The challenge is of course, we've got the fact that COVID-19 is more devastating to minorities. And the minorities are usually the frontline people. They're doing the work and giving the services necessary. And a challenge to that is a lot of the complainers about wearing masks are the same folks who demand these places open. So that's a problem. Now, what's happening is the audiences to sites like this they're getting younger because the elderly are aware that this COVID-19 is more deadly to them. So because these audiences are getting younger, we need to accommodate them. We need, and they come more armed. They come more knowledgeable about the fact. They come more knowledgeable in wanting a more diverse story, a more complete story. They don't want that fairy tale stuff. Is what I'm finding out. And I get the opportunity every day that I'm at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, and I address these young folks. The main thing that they're concerned about, black and white, is the fact that this family that owns this plantation has owned it for 13 generations. It's gone uninterrupted, and it's always been for profit. Of course, coming out of that, they want to know about reparations. Well, we talk about that, but what I tell them is this. I said, you can. That's an easy statement to make because you see the connection. That connection is unbroken from then to now. But I also say that, well, I don't know the makeup of this audience. I don't know you guys. I just met you today. I said there are other white folks in this audience too, and some of you guys might be descendants of slave owners. How liable are you if you use that same concept for the Draytons? Now, the opportunity. Here's the opportunity. The opportunity is this. Because of COVID-19, I used to sleep in these places here, and I used to invite bunches and bunches of folks, and we used to sit around these campfires and just have conversation, eye to eye, face to face. Well, now we still do it, but we do it virtually. We have these Zoom conversations, and now we're having these same conversations, but we're just sitting at a computer in the comforts of our own home. Now that is allowing me to reach more people, to touch more people with the Slave Dwelling Project. We still have the same conversation. We talk about the weddings on plantations. We talk about the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's life. We talk about Mr. Arbery being hunted like an animal and shot. And shot. We talk about all these things. We talk about white supremacy. We talk about historical trauma. But now we turn this COVID virus into an opportunity to reach more people.
Excellent, thank you. You mentioned weddings at plantations, and I think we had a question earlier about it. What are your feelings about African Americans who have weddings at plantations? Because I think I've seen a few people have their weddings at plantations or at cabins that are located on plantations.
I've gone to an African American family, an African American wedding at a plantation. I know of another couple, African American couple, who got married on a plantation because they had ancestral ties to that plantation. I've heard of others with the same concept of having ancestral ties to that plantation, and I have no problem with that. You know, if they can trace their roots, their history back to that plantation, they want to have a wedding there. Again, I'm okay with that. Just as I'm okay with family reunions on plantations.
So one of the things that I've noticed, well, that you taught me to do, and I think I've been doing it ever since you first showed me, is looking for fingerprints when you come to historic sites. And I know we did that today when you first got here, and the fingerprints in the bricks. So when you come to historic sites like Montpelier, and as you travel around and go visit historic sites, and you look at these old bricks, and you can usually find fingerprints, indentions left. What do you think is the importance of finding those fingerprints, and what does that mean to you?
Well, it's important because in order for the white narrative, the white male narrative, to exist, to continue to exist, there's some type of documentation that justifies it. Not saying that the folks who documented it didn't come with biases and prejudices and white supremacy in mind. They did. But because we've been deprived, we've been muted, they made it illegal to educate us, we need all the evidence that we could get. We've got archaeologists, they could dig beneath the earth and just dig up stuff and just make it gospel, which is a beautiful thing. We've got archivists who could search through these papers that exist and pull things out of these. But then we got the physical. We got these structures, and these structures that are made of bricks. Our enslaved ancestors made these bricks, and it goes back to what you said. Sometimes in the making of these bricks, in taking the bricks out of the mold, they were still a little malleable, and you could put indentions in them, and some did. So when you find these fingerprints and you put your fingers in these fingerprints, you're touching an enslaved person, the person who made that brick, and I interpret it as them reaching out to us, saying, "I was here, tell my story."
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite things, is being able to literally put your fingers in there, the same place that one of our enslaved ancestors, whether you're from that location or not. We have one final question before we start to wrap up.
So, do you think that people's minds can be changed? And how do you work to change people's minds if they see things differently than you?
Joe?
Well, they're old dogs. Hard to teach them new tricks. But that does not mean you stop delivering your message. I was in an audience one day, standing room only, and there was 2 African American females. And after the presentation, the eldest African American female said, "I enjoyed your presentation. You sure told them." And I told her, so I said, "Ma'am, the presentation is the same no matter who the audience is." Now, as far as the youth are concerned, I think the earlier we get to them, and we talked about this already, the earlier we get to them in telling them the truth, I think the better off that we'll be. Again, there's that hope for this younger generation of people. I gave the example of my daughter, bringing friends home. That shows me hope. But we got to be persistent with our message. And we got to be able to, withstand the rain, because there's going to be those naysayers out there. There's going to be resistance to that message, and that resistance may come from the top. But we know what we're doing is justified. We know what we're doing is the truth. We know that it's necessary that the stories of the enslaved people be told. So we just got to continue doing what we do.
I agree. I think we also have to acknowledge our own privilege, whether it's economic or racial or sexual orientation or gender privilege. And I think that we can overcome but we also have to acknowledge the benefits that we have, and then also work to make sure that we can bring others up with us. And with that, I would definitely like to thank you, Joe, for joining us tonight. And I know that you'll be here tomorrow. And I hope all of you all join us tomorrow for the second part of this amazing discussion. Tomorrow night's topic will be Echoes of the Enslaved and the Legacies of Colonization. And my friend Joe McGill here will be back here probably in that very same chair. And he will be accompanied by a Piscataway elder, Rico Newman, who's local here to Prince George's County, and we're excited to host both of you here tomorrow night for that amazing discussion. We want to thank you all for joining us today. Please be safe out there with COVID-19 going on, but also please continue further your learning. Learn about not just the legacies of enslavement and colonization here in Prince George's County, but wherever you live throughout the country, and hopefully expanding your minds and teaching others, and invite your friends and your family to join us next time. Thank you and have a great night.